Hello, human biology students. I'm going to pick up just right exactly where we left off. We just finished up talking about bones and the bone structure. We're still going through connective tissue, and I kind of mentioned that blood is a part of that. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of blood. So, blood is considered a connective tissue, which I think is kind of I don't know, I feel like that kind of goes against the grain of what we really might consider connective tissue. There, I had something over my face. So this is a picture of blood, and it just really shows the diversity of different types of cells that we actually see in blood. And you can see that some are very large and some are much smaller. So just a quick overview. So even when we talk about, so these are red blood cells, which I think is pretty recognizable for most of you. But when we talk about white blood cells and the other things that are in blood, so white blood cells, there's a lot of different kinds of white blood cells. Here we have a macrophage. So macrophages are cells that eat and digest other cells, and they're very large. Neutrophils, and we can see this is considered grainy. I think it talks about this a little bit later in the notes, or maybe it does down here. No, not on this slide. So erythrocytes is another, just because it's mentioned down here. So red blood cells, another name for red blood cells are erythrocytes. So whenever we talk about erythrocytes, we're always talking about red blood cells. Leukocytes, we're always talking about white blood cells. White blood cells, a lot of times if you get sick and go to the doctor, they're going to look for whether or not you have elevated WBC, which is your white blood cell count. And it indicates that if your white blood cell count is elevated, it indicates that there's some type of infection that your body's trying to fight. That's one of the things they look for. If your white blood cell count is really low, that can indicate diseases as well, such as cancer, actually. So lots of types of cancer, types of lymphoma, for example, which is cancer of like lymph nodes or spleen or anywhere in that lymphatic system. One of the big warning signs of that is that the white blood cell count is dangerously low. And they'll look for specific white blood cells, like they'll do a neutrophil count, okay? And if your neutrophil count is really low, you get classified as neutropenic, and they have to take extra precautions because basically they say you don't have enough. If you don't have enough neutrophils, you can't fight even a simple infection. So cancer patients and chemo patients have to constantly monitor their neutrophil level. But anyway, so leukocytes, are white blood cells, are very used a lot to measure. Those levels can indicate various types of diseases that could be present. I'm just looking at what other, okay, so this is a white blood cell, this is a white blood cell, this monocyte is another white blood cell, a lymphocyte, basophil, and there's more than what's here. And then the other thing that we find in that blood matrix are things called platelets. So these I'm looking for if they even have one labeled on here, I'm not sure. Oh yeah, here, platelets. So these very tiny little, they're like fragments of a cell really that are given off. Those are the platelets. So we're going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. So we know red blood cells, we always say they carry oxygen, but the reality is they carry everything. I'm so in the way here. They carry everything, not just oxygen. They're also responsible for carrying food particles. I'm going to write on the board here. Actually, and hormones and everything else get carried through that blood matrix system. But we know that red blood cells are really good at carrying oxygen, but remember that your blood also transports nutrition, right, to the rest of the body. Platelets are these magical little things that help your blood clot, and they're really important. And the they're really just formed by pieces of cell that get shaved off, but they're that clotting factor. So people who have issues with clotting in their blood tend to be low. There's a disease that makes your body not produce enough of those platelets. That disease is hemophilia. There's a couple different kinds, one more severe than the other. But yeah, they're really important. People who have hemophilia actually have to go in for transfusions and actually get platelets. And so when we talk about the lymphatic system, I said the lymphatic system includes lymph nodes and spleen, and it's all connected by lymphatic vessels. The lymph is actually the fluid that kind of everything. We find the white blood cells kind of in these lymphatic tissue, in the lymphatic tissue, like in the lymph nodes and so on. This is why, so because the lymphatic tissue is all connected, so your lymph nodes are all kind of connected and your spleen is part of that lymphatic system, if they find cancer in one lymph node, they're very concerned that it has, that it may have spread to other lymph nodes. And if it has, it can spread pretty quickly if they don't notice it right away. If it's just if it's cancer in one lymph node, they can remove that or a couple lymph nodes. But if they, kind of catch it too late or it's very aggressive, it can navigate through that entire lymphatic system. And then it's like you kind of can't live without that. And if chemotherapy doesn't take care of it, obviously that's really a problem. All right. So I know, so I'm actually making this video for Monday. I'm kind of revamping the schedule for this week. So I hope that didn't cause a lot of confusion, for any of you. But as you move through that tissues lab, you kind of need this information first. I want to talk about the different types of muscle tissue. There's only 3 main types of muscle tissue. So they're obviously made of muscle fibers, and this myosin and actin fibers are an important part of how muscles work or allowing muscles to work. So there's 3 types of muscle tissues. We're going to talk about each of them specifically. So skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, and they look a little different. And that's as you move through the tissues lab, hopefully you can see that. So skeletal muscles obviously are for movement, right? So skeletal is for movement. Wouldn't do you any good to have bones that if you didn't have muscles attached to them, right? So skeletal muscles are for movement, appearance. So we're looking at right here, skeletal muscles. These are the 3 main types. Skeletal muscles, this striated fibers, you can see these little lines in here. That's what they're talking about. They're attached to the bone for movement, for specifically voluntary movement. Excuse me. So that's how you can kind of see how they're different. So and it makes sense. All these little lines in here. Remember, skeletal muscles have to be able to stretch as you extend a muscle. So you extend your muscle. And then retract it back. By the way that muscles work, and I want to just kind of show you this too. So there's a flexor and extension. Muscles work in pairs. Muscles only pull limbs. So if I look at my arm, when I move my arm up, it's because the muscle that's here is attached to this bone, and I'm contracting this muscle and it's pulling it. To straighten my arm, I have to use the muscle on the bottom side that's attached to this bone and then back to here. And so I'm pulling, this muscle is contracting to pull that limb straight. So skeletal muscles work in pairs like that. And again, this is voluntary movement. Smooth muscle, we find smooth muscle, excuse me, lining the walls of organs and so on. This is more that involuntary movement. So something like your bladder, for example, would be an example of a smooth muscle, right? It's kind of voluntary, but it kind of becomes involuntary after a while. It's smooth because if compared to the other two, look it just looks a little bit smoother. So again, the name kind of explains what that structure looks like. So I think if you can remember that, it should be easy to remember. And then cardiac muscle, our heart is, you know, very powerful, and it obviously has a really important job. The way that I remember the cardiac tissue looking differently are these intercalated discs. It's these little lines in here. These are called the intercalated discs. And that's different than skeletal muscle tissue, which has, you know, lines all over the place, right? And then smooth muscle, we don't see anything like that. So these intercalated discs between the cells are very obvious and very prominent, and you don't see that. It almost looks like a cell wall, like between plant cells, but we know that animal cells don't have cell walls. So that is just that separation between the cells. Obviously, cardiac muscle tissue, involuntary. You don't just decide to make your heart beat. It better work without you telling it to. Otherwise, we might forget, right? So then the other part, the last or the next tissue that I wanted to go through really quickly is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue, obviously very important for none of our cells are going to work. None of our muscle tissue cells would work without nervous tissue, right? Telling those muscles when to move and how to move and so on. So this allows for communication between those cells through sensory. So whenever we talk about sensory, it's what you're feeling, what you're hearing, what you're smelling, and so on. So that sensory input, there has to be some sort of sensory input, integration of data, and then motor output. Oh, that's terrible. I got a knot right on there. Motor output is that reaction of the muscle. So when we talk about motor output, reaction of the muscle. So there's two main cell types, neurons and neuroglia, we're going to talk about. So the basic structure of a typical nerve cell, and there's more than one type, but they all tend to be long. They have this long body, which is called the axon, and this is where that nerve cell, so this is where this receives some sort of stimulus, or in this, it's showing the, it's getting a signal from this nerve cell, right? So these little dendrites are the very tips of the branches that receive this electrochemical impulse. And then this is the cell body. This is the nucleus right here. So this is the main cell body of a nerve cell. So it receives this electrochemical signal through something called the synapse. So the synapse is the little tiny space between this nerve cell and these dendrites. That electrochemical signal goes through. This is going to move through the axon. It's insulated by this myelin sheath. That's not labeled on here. These blue things are actually the myelin sheath. And then this travels through, and then it's going to send the signal to the next nerve cell, and so on, until it reaches the central nervous system, which we'll talk about later. So obviously nerve cells, very important. It's eventually then the central nervous system, or the brain, is going to send a signal back to the limb saying, oh my gosh, that's hot, we need to move this muscle and pull away from here. That's kind of the quick overview. The central nervous system, and really all the systems, work together, but the central nervous system is super important in maintaining homeostasis, to maintain that dynamic equilibrium in the body. I can see I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm just going to let you read through this on your own. The difference between a negative feedback loop and a positive feedback loop. So if I'm just going to have you kind of go through that on your own. Thank you.